Hey Phil, this is Cameron.
Hey, what's up, Kim?
Man, I gotta talk to you about something. Have you been watching the news?
Dude, what is going on? Pocket politics with Phil and Cam. Why? Why are we doing this?
I think it's gonna matter.
The only thing they want to talk about is guns and abortion.
My own views, I want to see the Republicans get away from the social issues.
I'm not saying that Republicans are idiots.
You hear something like that, it's powerful.
As an American, I was disgusted.
You could make the argument that you're probably more in the middle as well.
I think that's just a story that somebody's telling you.
Again, well, with the facts, this is true. Everybody knows
What
it.
facts?
So-
What facts? Who does this hurt more, Republicans or Democrats?
Boy, I've been thinking about that.
Welcome back to Pocket Politics. Cam, how are you doing today?
Doing well. How are you?
Pretty good, pretty good. So today we've got a new development, more information about what we talked about last week with the Silicon Valley Bank, and turns out two other banks as well ended up kind of collapsing in this process. We're going to talk about big time Trump news. He is back in the news, causing trouble, and running for president. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We've also got some DeSantis talk. Is he running? We don't know yet. He doesn't seem to know. We will find out, but certainly some news on some things that he said this week. And we will circle around to January 6th. We've got an Air Force colonel that just got convicted. And then we'll talk about the highly controversial Willow Project, among other things. And for our listeners, just a tease for now, but we've got some big news about the next episode. Stay tuned through this one to find out what we're talking about. Cam, you ready to get us started?
Yeah, let's go. Let's talk some Silicon Valley Bank stuff. If this stuff's staying in the news here. You know, this past week we learned the government said they're going to protect all accounts, including those over $250,000. You and I have talked, Phil. This kind of set off people from both sides of the political aisle. You know, people on the left are saying, "Here goes the government just protecting the wealthy." People on the right are upset that the government's doing bailouts. So we've got more drama kind of going here, and we've got some other issues with, you know, some news of this kind of rippling around the world and some other banks. So, Phil, why don't you tell us about these two other banks that appear to be collapsing as a result of this?
Well, I'm not going to dig into that too much, but basically, you know, this, as a result of the bank run, there was two other banks that kind of had some issues. We will see how their problems are resolved. I think the biggest part of this news is yes, that while it seemed like at first it was a little bit of socialism for the wealthy, with the Biden administration, you know, guaranteeing all of the deposits above $250,000. You know, it's turning out to look like, just like many other things, the Biden administration played this one correctly. And one thing to note about that is that 80% or more of their deposits were from companies. And so if they hadn't guaranteed it, that'd have been fine, right? These companies owned by probably extremely wealthy, you know, tech bros and stuff like that would have collapsed. The problem with that is that they wouldn't have been able to make payroll. And so what you would have seen was a lot of everyday, ordinary, middle-class people all of a sudden not getting paid the money that they had earned because they were on the payroll of these companies.
You mentioned Biden got it right. It doesn't really matter what he does in these highly politicized times. He's going to take heat. And like I said, this time he's kind of taking heat from both sides of the aisle. So biggest thing here, I think you kind of mentioned it, is, you know, that these tech companies involved, right? And then the fact that the government is going to take care of, you know, kind of the fallout from this is probably the big story. As I mentioned earlier, too, there seems to be lessons learned, you know, being learned from this whole thing around the world. This past week, we definitely saw bank stocks kind of doing an up and down thing as a result of this. Early in the week, on March 13th specifically, bank stocks fell sharply. First Republic Bank shares fell 65%. Then the following day, bank stocks seemed to largely recover. First Republic climbed back nearly 60%. So again, we're kind of seeing this ripple effect. There seems to be still certainly some skepticism out there. Remains to be seen about other or banks, I should say, going under. But right now, it seems like maybe the storm has been calmed down a little bit, at least, as we see the government kind of stepping in and helping out with this one. Phil, you got anything else on the bank?
I do, yeah. So it's important to note that as part of the FDIC that was, set up by President Roosevelt, somewhere around 80 years ago, right? As part of that, the banks now, any bank that operates has to donate into a fund, right? And that fund is there universally to protect those FDIC insured investments up to 250,000. And so it's important to understand that the money that the Biden administration is basically using to protect all the deposits is coming out of that FDIC fund. And so that's, one reason he was able to come out and say, look, we're not going to use any taxpayer dollars on this. This is all money that's basically set aside for that purpose anyway. So I think they played it right. The one other thing that I would note is that this is kind of the first time we've ever seen behavior like this, and this was largely started. Yes, there was bad behavior at Silicon Valley Bank that was going on, right? They had recently, basically created more shares of stock to sell because they were having some issues. And, with interest rates rising, their investment in government bonds were going to return a lower value if they tried to sell them before they matured. And so they did do fairly risky stuff that did not help them out. But this was largely sparked by one guy tweeting. And so Peter Thiel, he's a huge tech company, right? A partial owner of PayPal, started all this with a tweet, which is we're starting to see the dangers, if we haven't paid attention before, of social media being involved in stuff like this. And so this one tweet basically prompted everybody to go and take their money out of SVB, which resulted in the government having to step in. It is kind of an interesting thing that we've never seen before, but it's because we didn't have all this technology and risky lending. And then the one last thing I'll say is that the Justice Department basically came in and said, yep, we are already on it, and they are investigating the fact that multiple SVB shareholders had sold significant amounts of stocks. I mean, one of them was like 11% of the shares in the company were sold in the month of February. So we will see. There's definitely going to be more coming out about this, I would say. Wouldn't you?
Yeah, you mentioned the Justice Department. The Wall Street Journal reported also the Securities and Exchange Commission is also probing into this one. You mentioned the tweet, Peter Thiel. Let's not forget high-profile investor Michael Burry also played a part in this too when he warned people with a tweet. It's possible today we found our Enron, and he kind of helped. I say helped. He was also fueling the fire in this one. So definitely some stuff here for Justice Department and as I mentioned, Securities and Exchange Commission to look at. So we shall see going forward. But why don't we shift now to the big news this week, which is this looming, shall I say, Trump indictment, or certainly the strong possibility of it. Phil, what do you got on this one?
Well, so this is one facet of what we've got to talk about with Trump, but it all kind of started Friday morning, late Thursday, something around that, when we found out that basically multiple law enforcement agencies were called into the district attorney's office for a meeting. This is Alvin Bragg, the guy who's investigating the Stormy Daniels hush money payment, and basically said, or it's speculated that they held a briefing on the repercussions and law enforcement's needs and security and things like that because indictments were coming. We haven't heard anything formal. Basically, the biggest thing that we've heard is from the man himself. So he truthed over the weekend that he was going to be indicted on Tuesday and basically called for violence. And that has led to all kinds of stuff. I saw a Rolling Stone article that talked about chat rooms were discussing making a moat of conservative gun carrying people around Mar-a-Lago to protect the former president. Who knows? I mean, what else do you have to add?
Well, for starters, I want to circle back to Alvin Bragg, I should say, to kind of give our listeners a little bit of background on him. He's that Manhattan district attorney, Phil, who you mentioned here a minute ago. So, just so our listeners are aware, he's the first black district attorney in Manhattan history. He ran and was elected as a reformer. That's what he told people he was going to do, was reform, the justice system there, and so that's kind of what propelled him into this office. Prior to being the Manhattan district attorney, he served as a U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York. He was also a civil rights lawyer, was a professor and co-director of the New York Law School Racial Justice Project. And he's worked on Trump cases in the past, helping to sue the Trump administration over 100 times. He also sued the Donald J. Trump Foundation for $2 million, which resulted in Trump paying out money to various charities and the foundation's dissolution. And he led the suit out there that was against the disgraced film producer Harvey Weinstein for hostile work environment. So what we're seeing here is that Alvin Bragg, he's got, he's definitely got a history here of being involved in things and got a, certainly a pedigree that points to the fact that this guy's a, pretty qualified attorney. I also want to point out, this is not a case he started. He inherited this case from his predecessor, Cy Vance. So basically, he took up the reins here as it was passed over to him on this. But he does have a history of going after Trump and being pretty involved in legal cases. So
yeah, and I just wanted to say too, real quick. I don't know if if our listeners will remember this, but this is also the case that he basically looked like he was not going to prosecute when he turned it over from Cy Vance last year, right? And he had those two top lawyers that were working on it for him kind of resigned in protest. And it looked like this one was kind of dead in the water, and all of a sudden now they've brought in some new attorneys to help on it, and it looks like the former lawyer who made the actual payments, Michael Cohen, has been cooperating and testified 20 something times to give information on details around these payments. But effectively, this is a campaign finance trial, right? And that's the substance of what this case is built around.
Yeah, I mean, I've watched, some various news outlets talk about this. I've also read up on this. I'll be honest with you, compared to everything else that Trump has, that he's facing, this one seems like kind of a weak case. I'm not saying there isn't anything here. I'm just saying, kind of compared to everything else that's going on, this one, to me, seems to kind of be the weaker of all of his other legal problems. And so, it is getting some pushback, I guess, on this, as just everything else that is involved with Donald Trump, things turn political. We've heard some people speaking out in defense of the president, or the former president, to include his former vice president, Mike Pence. Why don't we play the clip on what Mike Pence had to say about this?
All right.
The idea of indicting a former president of the United States is deeply troubling to me, as it is to tens of millions of Americans, and particularly happening in what appears to be a politically charged environment in New York, where the Attorney General and other elected officials literally campaigned on a pledge to prosecute.
And there we go. What about it, Cam?
Well, the question I have is, for Mike Pence, who's, basically, from what we hear at least, considering a presidential run in 2024, I'm not really sure what side of the aisle, or I shouldn't say side of the aisle. We obviously know Mike Pence is a Republican, but I'm not really sure where he stands on some of these issues, in particular Donald Trump. I mean, this has been something that Mike Pence has struggled with in the past. Does he speak out against Trump? Does he not? Here, a week or two back, we saw him come out with some pretty harsh words about the president and his actions on January 6th. And now Pence has this to say about his former boss. He kind of seems to be going back and forth here.
This is a perfect example of why Pence will never get elected to anything ever again, in my opinion. I mean, we don't know where the guy stands. It's like he's willing to say, that he doesn't approve of the president basically inciting a mob to come attempt to kill him. and his family. But other than that, everything's just about okay. I mean,
yeah, I mean,
it just
like I said, I mean, I have heard some commentary out there from other people suggesting this is kind of a weaker case, and I do kind of agree with them. I think this is, again, I think this one is probably small potatoes compared to some of the other stuff Donald Trump is facing. But
yeah, to be clear though, I don't think it's a weak case. I think it's a strong case. All the evidence there. It is just the smallest of the potential violations.
yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, you know, you talk about evidence. I mean, Michael Cohen is cooperating, but Michael Cohen is not exactly the most truthful of men. So you know, there's been some people talking about that this week too. That yeah, I mean, great, Michael Cohen is suddenly cooperating, but is he actually telling the truth now? Because he doesn't have a history of doing that. So,
well, he
but
doesn't have a history of not. He doesn't have a history of not doing that. I mean, basically, you know, yes, he did shady things while working for Trump, but once he was fired by Trump himself, he came out and testified in front of Congress, and nothing was a lie. I mean, there were no gotcha moments. I mean,
yeah, he was. Well, let's go back though to his employment during the Trump administration. He was a very shady character, and so I think there's going to be
he's the guy that made the hush money payment himself, right?
Yeah, and so there's going to most likely be, you know, when this thing, you know, hits the courtroom or whatever, as we talk about this indictment, there's going to be people attacking Michael Cohen's character. I mean, you and I know that. That's how these things go. Any chance a lawyer or someone thinks they can gain an edge up, they'll use it. And I think that's one angle people have to watch out for. And that is the thing. Trump's going to fight this indictment very hard.
Yeah, I just think the fact that the fact that Mark Pomerantz and I can't remember the other lawyer's name had resigned last year, basically in full protest over the fact that this case was solid and should have been prosecuted, and then the two new attorneys that you know, have been brought in are highly regarded and considered some of the best out there that are working on this now, means that, you know, it probably has a pretty good likelihood of success. We will certainly see. My biggest thing is do you think is this kind of the tip of the iceberg right here? If this goes through, Trump gets indicted and is successfully prosecuted, is it just going to be a windfall of other cases coming through?
Well, first of all, that's a huge if, because we don't know how this one's going to play out. But, you know, it's so very, very hard to tell with Donald Trump. And I'm not saying that to try and dodge the question. I really am not. But I just think this is it. With Donald Trump, there is so much unpredictability that I have a hard time answering that. I mean, part of me says yes, right? Because there's all these other looming legal cases out there. But then, you know, part of me sits here and looks at it and says, well, this is Donald Trump, and look at how he, you know, has gotten around issues in the past and such. So, you know, to be honest with you, I have a very hard time answering that one. I mean, yeah, to be honest, I will just say this. There certainly is the possibility of it, but with Donald Trump, you can never be certain. I will say that.
Yeah, and I think we're at total, it's like 22 separate cases in the works at some various level right now. So, yeah, we'll see. And then I think the other big question surrounding this is, does a 12-person jury, regardless of the circumstances, all vote in agreement against the former president? I mean, do they find that jury of 12?
That's a good question. And again, I have a hard time answering that one too.
Yeah, I think that may be the hardest question, honestly.
But there's other stuff coming out of this, you know. Phil, you mentioned kind of all the drama surrounding it. New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu this morning on, I forget where I saw him on, I think it was CNN. He just said this is going to be a real circus when it all, you know, kind of hits the press here this week if he's indicted. You know, there's many Republican allies, at least, to the former president, are saying this is politically motivated, and they are pointing to Alvin Bragg's background. When they say that, Trump attorney himself says there's going to be no standoff in Mar-a-Lago. In other words, if Trump is indicted, do not expect there to be some grand standoff down in Mar-a-Lago as he tries to avoid arrest. I will say, though, that this does bring up some other questions. Now, do his political opponents try and seize this moment, this opportunity, I should say, this moment that's out there now? And when I say political opponents, I'm talking about the other people that are potentially running for president in 2024. And one, in the case, Nikki Haley, has actually thrown her hat into the ring, so to speak. Is this something, Phil, that someone like a Nikki Haley, Mike Pompeo, whomever these other people running, is this something they can use now to seize the moment on, or how's that going to play out?
No, because they've all shown that they have no willingness to move away from liking Trump, right? And so, if anything, this fuels grievance politics more than it does anything else, right? And I would almost bet that the reaction to this is more, look how unfair it is that they're going after Donald Trump. We see it with Pence, where he can't solidify a position against a guy who tried to effectively kill him and his family. And I just don't see it. I don't think DeSantis is going to say anything about it. We'll talk more about him in a minute. But all these people know that if they come out hardline against Trump, they lose that 28 to 30% of the Republican Party who vehemently, adamantly supports him, right?
So, well, yeah, no, there is certainly that risk to all of this, and right now, it's hard to say. Maybe DeSantis tries to seize it, as you said, Phil. We're going to talk about him in a few minutes, so I'm not going to go too far down that rabbit hole. But maybe Ron DeSantis tries to jump on it. I don't see Nikki Haley, Pompeo, any of these other ones trying to throw themselves on that Donald Trump, grenade over this. I will say Steve Bannon is saying that he thinks this is going to be a huge political victory for Trump. And he's also joining former President Donald Trump in calling for protests surrounding this. Elon Musk tweeted here recently, this is a political boost for Donald Trump. And so several people are saying they think it's going, I say several, I just named two, some other kind of allies of them are saying they think this is going to be a political win for him. Going forward, how does this affect the general election? We're still a long way out from the general election. So to be honest with you, I don't know that this affects it a whole lot yet, just because we're so far away and a lot can happen in the next year and some change before that one really comes to head on this. So I think we'll certainly see some of our questions answered this week. First of all, does he truly get indicted this week? We don't know that for certain, but the indications are there that he will be, potentially indicted on this.
Yeah, funny though that the main indication that we have is just Trump posting on his Truth Social.
Yeah, and speaking of Donald Trump posting on Truth Social, Donald Trump did come back onto another popular social media platform here this past week, and that is Facebook. We had not heard anything from Donald Trump on Facebook since he was reinstated recently by the Meta platforms. So he was allowed to come back onto Facebook, but he'd remained silent, and we hadn't heard anything from him. And all of a sudden here, this past Friday, he comes back onto Facebook out of nowhere, posts a simple message that says, "I am back." And he had a short video clip on there with him also from CNN, or the clip was from CNN from the night of his 2016 presidential election. I guess he also put a YouTube clip up. His election team is very excited about this because they think Facebook is a huge boost to his campaign. Let's remind our listeners, Donald Trump was banned from virtually all major social media platforms following the January 6th. Phil, are we going to see Donald Trump back on Twitter and everything else now, or was this just some kind of one-off post he made on Facebook because he was bored?
Yeah, I don't really know. I also don't really care. I think that Facebook is telling because it's largely the platform for older, Americans. Like most people under the age of 30 don't really use Facebook anymore. So I can see where it's a boost for people that like Trump, but I just don't know that this makes an impact, and I don't really care if he goes back on Twitter. But some of that's because I'm not on Twitter, but it wouldn't surprise me if he is back on there. Elon Musk has already signaled that, he has no interest in cultivating an actual town forum or whatever he called it, and just more or less wants to become a place where hate speech and other anti-Semitic stuff can be spread. So whatever, it is what it is. I mean, he's going to be back on social media. We see how short people's memories are of crimes that are committed, and we'll move on.
Well, his election team again is I say they're excited because they feel like this is a huge fundraising platform for him to be on, and a chance for him to get his message out there going into 2024. So again, he's back on Facebook, at least with one post. I think it's only a matter of time before we see him on virtually all the other major platforms, to include Twitter, because I think there's only so long he can stay on his Truth Social. I think in Donald Trump, in his nature, he's going to want to get out there as much as he can. And I think this is just kind of the signaling of Mr. Trump coming back into the social media, or I should say the mainstream social media arena. So with that story kind of wrapping up, or at least us wrapping up our topics on it, I want to turn now to another 2024 potential presidential hopeful, and that's Ron DeSantis. And so this past week, he had some things to say about Ukraine and the aid that we're sending over there. Specifically, what Governor DeSantis said was the war in Ukraine is a territorial dispute. And he has received quite a bit of pushback from this, Phil, particularly from members in his own party. This past week, we heard some Republicans speaking out, to include the Republican whip in the Senate, John Thune. He had some words to say about this, and we've got that for our listeners here. Why don't we play that?
What message does it send to Vladimir Putin when one of the leading potential contenders for the Republican presidential nomination says that this is not a vital interest for the United States, this war in Ukraine, and that it's merely a territorial dispute?
Well, I mean, I think that there are lots of different opinions on U.S. involvement in Ukraine, but I think the majority opinion among Senate Republicans is that the United States has a vital national security interest there in stopping Russian aggression, and that's certainly the view I have.
All right, and back at it, Kim.
Okay, so that was John Thune there. We heard what he had to say on this, that he stands by Ukraine and that he feels the majority of the Senate Republicans feel that way as well. There were some other Senate Republicans were pushing back on him, Lindsey Graham amongst them. I want to also point out, Phil, the Wall Street Journal editorial board said they think this was Ron DeSantis' first big mistake that he has made, as now that he's, potentially this presidential candidate, even though I will remind our listeners, he has not officially entered the ring on this. So, Phil, what do you got on this one?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, it's no surprise to me that basically him saying it's a territorial dispute and some other things, right, which are basically the exact same words used by Vladimir Putin himself, are, he comes out and he says these things. Is it because his boss, Tucker Carlson, told him to, or, are these unique ideas of just him and Vladimir Putin? I don't know. I think, he should have known where the polling is on support for Ukraine, right? It's still pretty high, and a lot of people in the country still believe that we should be doing this support. So I'm not too sure exactly why he chose to kind of take a stand on this, but again, like you said, maybe this is all part of this plan of testing the waters, kind of dipping his toes in, seeing if, he's got some credibility in here. I just don't know. I mean, I think all things say that he is probably going to run for president in 2024. It almost seems like he's too late at this point, right? Like, the more the media starts talking about Trump, which apparently looks like it's going to be ramping up in the next couple of weeks, I think that the chances for DeSantis to kind of come in and make a good run for president, it becomes harder and harder. Right? Because we know that what people say, any news is good news, right? And the more we start talking about Trump, DeSantis is just going to get shoved to the side and lose his kind of window of opportunity. Now, we've talked about it before. He doesn't have to run. He's pretty young, so he's certainly got time left. I just don't know that, one, this is helpful for him to come out and basically repeat the Kremlin talking points, and that it's going to work in his strategy, whatever that strategy is, to maintain his popularity and his relevance in a campaign.
Yeah, Phil, you mentioned how a lot of the country is still backing Ukraine. I heard from New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu on CNN. He himself said that some Republicans have lost their moral compass on Ukraine. And he was speaking of members kind of from the far right wing of the Republican Party that have kind of taken that isolationist view now and want to step back away from Ukraine. And so he had that to say. As I mentioned, some of the, we talked earlier too about other Republicans that pushed back on DeSantis with this. But, I think with this one, DeSantis, to me, he seems like he's kind of struggling with an identity at times. And you look at this and it's like, how does he separate himself from Trump? I mean, basically at times what Ron DeSantis seems to be running as is just another Donald Trump. And so how does he break through? I mean, is he just going to be the next incarnation of Donald Trump? And if so, well, Donald Trump is running already. So why should voters go to him instead of Donald Trump? And there are some that suggest, well, Ron DeSantis he can be like Trump, but he can be more polished and he's more of a politician. He can get the message out better. So there is that. But let's also not forget too, Phil, he hasn't faced the national stage. He's done well in Florida, but we haven't seen him try and run a national campaign. And so he's got that looming too. He's got to be able to come back around and bring his message out to the masses around this country. And like I said, right now, it seems like he's just kind of basically being Donald Trump.
And
go ahead.
His entire political record is basically built around grievance politics. We talked about it earlier. It's just waging wars on books and college curriculum and all these different, a war on Disney and everything. So I don't really know, if he does in fact separate himself enough to compete. And it's funny, I heard on a podcast I was listening to this week, they kind of called him MAGA in the streets, but Rhino in the sheets. So I don't know where where he kind of comes out and identifies himself as the popular candidate in a world with Donald Trump and the Republican Party.
Yeah, I'll point this out. A recent poll, and I don't recall which poll this came from, but I did see it this week, had Trump up by 3 points on DeSantis in Florida. Now, that is just in Florida, okay? But DeSantis was lagging pretty good behind him on polls everywhere else in the country. And I heard some people saying, well, that looks really good for DeSantis. Look how he's doing in Florida. He's almost got Trump. It's within the margin of error down there, et cetera, et cetera. Personally, I don't think that really looks all that well for DeSantis myself. And I say that because as popular as DeSantis is in Florida, and he has shown that. I mean, he won his reelection last fall by, I want to say 20 points or somewhere, give or take, right? Somewhere fairly close to 20 points. I mean, he won by a big margin, and he won districts down in Florida that had been blue districts, and he won them. So he's very popular there. I think, to be honest with you, this poll should be showing DeSantis up by, beating Trump in Florida, and it's not. Yeah, it's close, but it's still not. I think if DeSantis really wants to beat Donald Trump, he needs to be crushing him in Florida and definitely doing better in polls around the nation. And so I'll be honest with you. I think DeSantis, I don't even know if he exactly knew what his message was going to be on this Ukraine thing. And he may even be sitting there now saying, maybe I kind of screwed that up, because some of these more mainstream Republicans that I wanted behind me are now pushing back quite a bit on me and the words I used. And as I mentioned earlier, people are saying, i.e. the Wall Street Journal, that this is a big, first big mistake he's made. So some of it will be how he recovers from this. And we'll see that in certainly going forward, because Ron DeSantis isn't going anywhere. Phil, as you mentioned, he still hasn't thrown his name in the hat. I think it's only a matter of time before he does. But yeah, I mean, we'll certainly see kind of how this Ukraine stuff plays out with him. But certainly took some heat this past week. Again, though, Ron DeSantis isn't going anywhere. And like I said, I think he's going to be running for president. So we'll continue to hear from the Florida governor. Speaking of issues, though, why don't we go to some January 6th news? We had a retired U.S. Air Force officer who was sentenced this past week in the January 6th riot. That specifically is Larry Brock, 55, of Grapevine, Texas. And as I mentioned, he's a retired U.S. Air Force lieutenant colonel and a former pilot at that. He was sentenced to 24 months for felony count of obstruction of official proceedings. Phil, what do you know about this Mr. Brock?
Not much, but it's kind of typical. I think the most disturbing thing is that we've got, a lot of these people that were formerly in the military. The Ashley Babbitt was a former, Air Force member as well, and she was the one that was shot by Capitol Police on January 6th, but it's disturbing that, again, this is the long list of people who swear an oath to protect the country from all enemies, foreign and domestic, and then turn around and become domestic enemies themselves. So, yeah, it's a trend that is kind of alarming, and especially, for guys like you and I, having been in the military for quite some time, quite disturbing, and I wonder, I would like to know where this, ideology and stuff is coming from, and how we can kind of stop this trend that we're seeing.
Well, so for our listeners, this Mr. Brock, he stormed the Capitol that day dressed in a helmet and a flak vest. He was also carrying zip ties the day of the riot, and after the riot was over and he was being questioned by authorities about why he was carrying zip tie handcuffs, his response was that he had found them on the ground in the riot and he was looking for a Capitol Police officer to give them to. Come on, man! Like, I mean, you gotta have a better line than that, So
yeah, and his social media too had kind of been combed through, and he had shown a history of kind of disturbing stuff as well. Yeah, I mean, there were Capitol Police officers there though that he could have turned over his his zip ties to.
Yeah, apparently he couldn't find any. Is what he was saying, I guess. Yeah, you mentioned his Facebook posts, Phil. They were certainly combed through by authorities and by attorneys as they were prosecuting this man. He was calling for a civil war on Facebook. He said traitors who are trying to steal this election should be executed. He had a whole bunch of other stuff there on social media. I also want to point out, though, that he was actually identified to the FBI by his ex-wife. So apparently his ex-wife was not happy with the man because she identified him. And this, when he was actually, or when this was actually talking about, or he was being sentenced, I should say, the judge had this to say, and I quote, "I think it's especially reprehensible and quite frankly unbelievable coming from a senior military officer. It's detailed, it's consistent, it's both astounding and atrocious, and we have no acceptance of responsibility and no showing of remorse whatsoever, zero," end quote. And so again, that's what the judge had to say in this sentencing. Not happy. And he also, again, points out the fact this guy was a senior military man and a career man. I don't remember if he was a reservist when he retired or if he was active duty. Regardless, this guy was a career military person or spent a number of years in the military. And because he's retired, he's getting a pension. So, Phil, I'll just ask you, in the case of someone sentenced in something like January 6th, right, a riot against the government, should they lose their pension?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the Uniform Code of Military Justice still applies when you are retired, right? And, I don't know how often they use stuff like that and try and go after retired military members, but if nothing else, maybe if the guy had broken some kind of low-level law or something like that, maybe it's not in our best interest to go pursue all those things. But the fact that he, broke a law that was in fact violating his oath as an officer that he took to participate in the Air Force, that I definitely think is worth it. What about you?
Well, I mean, I think because it is basically an attempt at overthrowing the government, or it's certainly seemed to be that way. I think there could probably be a case made. Will the military do that though and take this guy's pension? That remains to be seen. I'm not sure they'll go that far. And he got 24 months out of this, so maybe had it been more years. But the fact that it's only at 24 months. I don't know that the government takes his pension, but I do think a case could be made.
I don't think the sentence time should have anything to do with it. I think the fact that he was convicted is all that you need, regardless of how he was sentenced.
So I hear you on that. The only reason I made that comment was somebody may look at it and say, well, it was only 24 months, vice a 20-year sentence. Either way, though, I think the case could be made. I just don't know that the government is going to do it. I would not be surprised if Mr. Brock hangs on to his pension. So anything else on Mr. Brock, Phil?
No, that's all I got. Let's talk about this fairly controversial oil drilling project up in the very top, very northern regions of Alaska. This made quite a bit of news this week, was approved by the Biden administration, and a lot of people were upset with this one.
Yeah, I mean, this is a big project, $7 billion Alaskan oil drilling project by ConocoPhillips. It's located inside our National Petroleum Reserve up there. It's estimated to hold 600 million barrels of oil. With that, you mentioned Biden administration approved it. They did approve a scaled down version of the original project. It's down from, I believe, it was going to be 5 drill sites down to 3, and so less infrastructure is going to be involved in this than was originally proposed. It has environmental groups upset on this one. I will point out, though, Alaskan politicians from both sides of the aisle consider this a victory, to include Representative Mary Peltola and Senator Lisa Murkowski. They're citing increased jobs and revenue for their home state of Alaska.
Yeah, and one of the things that I was reading too, I can't remember if it was a Washington Post article or a CNN article or something, but I was reading that, the Biden administration felt kind of that their hands were largely tied. This had been tied up in environmental and other kind of lawsuits for a long time, and the administration, I think, just didn't feel like they were going to win this one if they tried to stop this thing in the first place, because it seemed to be proceeding all on its own without very much trouble. People are upset. It's supposed to kind of interrupt caribou migration, and then there's another bird, I think, that they're worried about. But I don't see this as a huge loss at any level. It's definitely not movement in the direction I think we should be going, but we're not 100% oil independent today, and so we've got to be able to kind of sustain some sort of use of fossil fuels until we get there, right? So I don't know that this is all that bad.
I think it's also personally kind of a sign of Biden maybe trying to swing a little bit to the middle ahead of the 2024 election. And so, this is a way, as you mentioned, right, to continue with our own oil production here. There's a lot of it up there in Alaska. As I mentioned, there was bipartisan support for this. So, yeah, I think, as you mentioned, right, it's not going to hurt us right now. We need oil. We are certainly not energy independent. We're not weaned off of fossil fuels, I should say. Regardless, though, again, there's some controversy surrounding this, but it's going to go through, and this Willow project will definitely push forward, and there will be oil pulled out of northern Alaska. So, speaking of I'm sorry, Phil, did you have anything else on this Willow project?
No, that's really all I got.
Speaking of some other news, I wanted to throw out really quick, just a quick mention, kind of to tie a loose end up here. Senator Mitch McConnell was released from the hospital this past week. I don't really have much other information on that, but we talked about him being in the hospital on our last episode. He was released this past week. Phil, have you heard anything at all about how he's doing or anything?
I haven't. The article that I read just said that he had been released and he was expected to recover fully. So hopefully, he'll be back on the floor soon. I would expect that within probably a week or two he will be, but we shall see.
Okay. And then one other bit of news here, too, as we look forward to the 2024 elections. I want to touch on Pennsylvania a little bit. And so in the state of Pennsylvania, they have a Senate seat coming open in 2024, and that's the seat currently held by Democrat Bob Casey. There is some rumors coming out of Pennsylvania now that Doug Mastriano may be interested in trying to run for that seat. And he's been generating some news up there. Find it kind of interesting that he's got his name in there. Now, let's remind our listeners, Mastriano ran for governor in the last election in Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania is a pretty swing state, pretty purple, really, in the grand scheme of things. And so we expect these statewide races in Pennsylvania to be pretty close. And we saw that in the Senate race last year when John Fetterman defeated Mehmet Oz by, I think it was 3 points, maybe even a little less than that. But Doug Mastriano, who had really dug his heels in on some far-right issues and really didn't want to bring his campaign at all into the middle or moderate any of his stances, this guy lost by double digits, and I think it was like 15 points that he lost to Josh Shapiro in the governor's race. Well, the question now is with Mastriano, if he gets in this Senate race, can this guy win a general race in Pennsylvania? Can he win a statewide race there? And so there's a number of Republicans are nervous about this because they see this as a seat that they could possibly win with the right candidate. But with a guy like Mastriano, there's a lot of nervous people in Pennsylvania. Phil, do you have anything on this Mastriano thing? I know a lot of it is pure speculation right now, and I just wanted to mention it for our listeners so that they're aware of kind of what's going on there.
Yeah, no, what will we see the MAGA twits fuck up next? Is kind of my only question looking forward. But we don't have to discuss that at this time. Hey, I do want to put a plug out there for our social media. You can link to all of our stuff on pocketpolitics.co. That's our website. Go there, click the little buttons, engage with us on social media. And we really appreciate the engagement. And, tell your friends and family. But I will say, looks like possibly next week we are going to have a city councilwoman from Wichita, Kansas on the show to talk and teach us some things about local politics, Cam. So we're looking forward to getting that interview with her in, and tune in, keep coming back and listening. And I think there's some interesting stuff. So hopefully you get a chance to learn some things. And Cam, I think you and I are going to learn some stuff as well. But a really, a small business owner turned city councilwoman. And so I think she can give us some insight into both of those things.
Yeah, definitely certainly looking forward to that interview. And as you mentioned, keep jumping on our social media, liking us. But it's been another great show here. We've gotten through all of our talking points for the week, so it's time to wrap things up with our parting shots. Phil, do you want me to kick it off with the parting shot?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, well, for my parting shot, let me just begin by saying never give up hope. So let me turn us to Florida here. And in the case of a man named Sidney Holmes, who had been sentenced to 400 years in prison, and he had served 34 years of this sentence, he was set free this past week. So Mr. Holmes, in April of 1989, was found guilty by a jury of being the getaway driver for two men who robbed two victims, taking their car at gunpoint outside a convenience store near Fort Lauderdale in June of 1988. And so, again, he'd been sentenced in 1989 and had been serving time ever since. Like I said, 34 years of a 400-year sentence. And he was exonerated, as I said, this past week after a review board re-examined the facts of his case, and they determined that he was very likely misidentified after spending 34 years in jail. This is just incredible that, certainly great the man was set free, but man, to imagine this guy did 34 years of his life sitting behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. But nevertheless, ladies and gentlemen, never give up hope. If you're interested in learning more about this story, I've got a story about this linked up on our website, or on our Facebook page, I should say. So certainly click on it. It's the USA Today article on it, but certainly click on it and read more about it, because this is a pretty incredible story, like I said. So it's definitely one to read about. Definitely one that I wanted to spend a minute or two talking about this week as well. So Phil, with that, over to you.
Yeah, so for my parting shot, I'm going to talk about parting. As yesterday, the overall number one seed, Kansas, dropped out of the NCAA tournament in the second round with a loss to Arkansas. So kind of disappointing. A lot of people, I know myself, of course, a big Kansas Jayhawks fan, had them picked to go all the way. But I'm going to blame it on the referees. There's been some other controversial calls. What was, thought to be kind of one of those mid-major teams that always makes a run and surprises everybody, Kennesaw State. They were also dropped out on, what I thought was kind of a controversial call right at the end of the game. And then we've also lost some other big teams. Number 4 seed Virginia is no longer with us. But best of luck to the teams that remain, and they don't call it March Madness for nothing, because it usually is a pretty wild tournament as it goes through. But that's all I have. Cam, I think with that being said, we can wrap it up for this week. You have anything else?
No, I don't, ladies and gentlemen. This was another great show. Thanks for listening. We certainly do appreciate it. And until next time.
All right. Bye.